A row of 12 storage units stood where my family's empty field had been, and strangers were unlocking them like they owned it. I'm Ethan Walker, and I legally owned every inch of that property. Yet HOA President Victoria Whitmore looked me in the eye and claimed the buildings already belonged to the community. I didn't know who authorized them or how deep this went. To understand how it happened, we need to go back to the day it began. 3 months before those storage units appeared, I was standing on my family's land with a clipboard in my hand, checking the measurements for a small renovation project I had planned for the property. My name is Ethan Walker, and I have spent most of my career as a civil engineer, so I trust numbers, documents, and facts more than rumors. That morning, my goal was simple: maintain the land my grandfather left behind and keep it ready for the future. I walked the property line, checked the old markers, and compared them with the survey records I had stored at home. Everything matched exactly. The land was mine. Then I noticed something strange near the eastern boundary. A section of the area that had always been open ground had been cleared. Fresh gravel covered the soil, utility lines had been installed, and construction stakes were planted in rows. I drove closer and saw workers preparing a foundation. I stepped out of my truck and asked what they were building. One of the workers looked surprised and said, "The storage facility project. The HOA approved it months ago." I remember standing there, holding my clipboard, trying to understand what I had just heard. The HOA had approved construction on my property, but nobody had contacted me. I called the county office to verify whether there was some mistake in the records. The person on the phone told me permits had been submitted for a community storage project connected to my neighborhood. That answer only created more questions. A few days later, I attended an HOA meeting expecting someone to explain the situation. Victoria Whitmore, the HOA president, walked into the room carrying a folder full of paperwork. She was calm, professional, and completely confident. She explained that the storage units were part of a long-term community improvement plan and that the project would benefit everyone. I asked the only question that mattered. Why was my land used for this project without my permission? The room went quiet for a moment. Victoria looked at her documents and said there must have been a misunderstanding regarding the property boundaries. I wanted to believe it was just an error. Mistakes happen. But when I returned home that evening and reviewed my original deed, I noticed something that made no sense. The paperwork showed my ownership clearly, yet the HOA had documents claiming authority over the same piece of land. I thought I was dealing with a simple boundary mistake. I was wrong. The next document I found would reveal that the storage units were never just a construction project. The next morning, I went back through every record I had connected to the property, but this time I was not looking for proof that I owned the land. I already knew that. I was trying to understand how the HOA believed they had the right to build anything there in the first place. I opened my grandfather's old survey documents, compared them with the county property maps, and noticed something unusual. The boundary lines on my deed and the county records matched, but the documents Victoria showed at the HOA meeting referenced a different parcel description. It was close enough to look legitimate, but the details did not line up. Someone had connected the storage project to a piece of property that looked almost identical to mine. That discovery changed the situation completely. This was not just a disagreement over interpretation. Someone had relied on information that did not match the actual ownership records. I contacted the county planning department and requested the permit file for the storage project. A few days later, I received dozens of pages showing how the approval process moved forward. The plans were real. The inspections were real. The permits were real. That was the part that bothered me most. The HOA had not secretly built a few small structures overnight. They had gone through official channels. They had engineers, contractors, and approvals. From the outside, they looked completely legitimate. When I asked the county employee how that was possible, she explained that local agencies usually review submitted information, but they do not determine every private ownership dispute before issuing permits. That answer gave Victoria exactly what she needed. She could point to the permits and say the project was approved. I realized I had a bigger problem than I expected. At the next HOA meeting, Victoria arrived prepared. She brought printed copies of the permits and financial projections showing how the storage units could benefit the neighborhood. She did not act angry. She acted reasonable. She told the homeowners that I was trying to stop a project designed to improve property values. Several residents nodded along. For the first time, I saw why she had been so confident. She was not fighting me with emotion. She was fighting me with a story that many people wanted to believe. I left that meeting without a victory. I had my deed, but Victoria had permits, supporters, and a completed plan already moving forward. I returned home and started looking through every page of the permit file one more time. Then I found a name I recognized from the construction documents, a consultant who had previously worked with my family years earlier. The question was no longer how the HOA built the storage units. The question was why someone connected to my own property history helped them do it. The name on the construction documents stayed in my mind all night. I knew that consultant, Mark Ellis, because he had helped my grandfather review the property boundaries years earlier. He was not a random contractor pulled from a list. He understood the history of that land. The next morning, I called him and asked a simple question. Why was his name attached to a project that had been built without my approval? There was a long silence before he answered. Mark told me he had been hired to review old property information provided by the HOA, not to verify ownership himself. He sounded uncomfortable, but then he said something that changed everything. According to him, Victoria Whitmore had specifically asked for historical records connected to my grandfather's land before the storage project was submitted. That meant she was not discovering the property boundaries by accident. She was looking for information about my land before construction began. I requested copies of every document Mark had received from the HOA. When the files arrived, I found something I did not expect. Buried between engineering notes and site plans was an older property map with handwritten markings. The map showed the storage area highlighted before the project was ever presented to the HOA board. The decision appeared to have been made before anyone publicly discussed the project. But there was still one thing I could not prove. I did not know whether Victoria misunderstood the records or knowingly moved forward anyway. That difference mattered. A mistake and a deliberate decision are two completely different battles. I decided not to confront her immediately. Instead, I started following the money behind the project. I looked into the storage units themselves and discovered they were not just planned for future community use. They were already being marketed to residents. The HOA had created rental agreements, assigned unit numbers, and started collecting monthly payments. I felt the situation shift beneath me. The buildings on my land were no longer just a construction dispute. They were an operating business. When I brought this information to my attorney, he warned me not to move too quickly. He explained that proving ownership was one issue, but proving financial benefit from unauthorized use was another. Victoria had built layers around herself, and every layer made the fight harder. Meanwhile, Victoria changed her approach. She stopped saying the project was simply a community improvement. She began telling residents that shutting down the storage units could cost the neighborhood thousands of dollars and create problems for everyone who had already rented space. She was no longer defending the construction. She was defending the future she had created. Then I received an envelope from the HOA that made my stomach drop. Inside was a notice claiming I had interfered with a community asset and was responsible for delaying operations on the storage facility. The HOA was not backing away. They were preparing to make me look like the problem. The notice from the HOA arrived with a clean white envelope and a message written in language that sounded polite, but every sentence carried a warning. Victoria Whitmore claimed I had disrupted a community project, interfered with residents, and created unnecessary delays. The strange part was that I was the person whose land was being used. Yet somehow, I was being positioned as the obstacle. My attorney, Daniel Brooks, read through the notice carefully and told me something I did not want to hear. They are not trying to win the property argument yet. They are trying to control the story before the facts reach a courtroom. That changed my approach completely. Until that moment, I had been focused on proving the land was mine. I was thinking like an engineer. Measurements, boundaries, records. But Victoria was thinking differently. She was building public support, protecting her reputation, and making sure everyone saw her as the person defending the neighborhood. I stopped sending questions to the HOA and started watching what they were actually doing. I visited the storage facility during business hours and saw something I never expected. The units were not just being rented to homeowners. Several businesses were using them for commercial storage. Delivery trucks came in. Customers entered private access codes. The project Victoria described as a simple neighborhood benefit was operating like a full commercial facility. I documented everything carefully, but then I discovered a problem. The HOA had already created agreements that made the storage users believe everything was legitimate. Those people were not my enemies. They were ordinary residents and small business owners who had trusted the organization managing the community. That realization forced me to rethink my strategy again. I could not simply attack the facility and leave innocent people caught in the middle. I needed to prove what happened without damaging the people who had unknowingly participated. Then Daniel found another issue hidden inside the HOA records. The construction budget showed the storage project had been funded through a special assessment approved by the board. Hundreds of homeowners had paid fees believing they were investing in a community improvement. Victoria had convinced an entire neighborhood to support something built on a property ownership problem. For the first time, I saw the full scale of what I was facing. This was no longer just Victoria and me. It was a system she had built around the project. That evening, Daniel called me with a new discovery. He had found a document from the county file that changed the entire case. The document did not prove the HOA owned my land. It proved something much more complicated. Someone had specifically reviewed the ownership issue before the storage units were approved. Daniel's discovery changed the direction of the entire case. The county document showed that someone involved in the approval process had looked into the property ownership issue before the storage units were approved. That was the first piece of information that suggested this was not just a mistake. There had been questions, and someone had chosen to move forward anyway. With that document, my attorney recommended a formal demand letter to the HOA. We did not threaten. We did not exaggerate. We simply presented the ownership records, the permit concerns, and the evidence that the storage units were operating on my property. For the first time since this started, Victoria did not respond immediately. 2 weeks later, the HOA requested a private meeting. I walked into that room expecting another argument, but Victoria's attitude had changed. She was no longer the confident leader telling everyone the project was perfect. She was careful, measured, and clearly aware that the situation had become more serious. She offered a compromise. The HOA would pay me for the land use and create a formal agreement allowing the storage facility to continue. On the surface, it looked like the solution I had been fighting for. They were finally acknowledging that my property mattered. Daniel told me to be cautious. A settlement can solve a problem, but only if you understand what you are giving up. I reviewed the proposal line by line. The payment was significant. The agreement would have made the conflict disappear quickly. For a moment, I thought maybe this was the ending everyone wanted. Then I noticed a section buried near the end of the contract. The language did not simply compensate me for past use. It transferred future control of the property rights connected to the storage facility to the HOA. If I signed, I would be accepting money while giving them exactly what they had tried to take from me. I rejected the offer. Victoria looked disappointed, but she did not get angry. Instead, she calmly explained that if we went to court, the HOA would argue they had improved my land and created value that should benefit everyone involved. That argument bothered me because part of it was true. They had created something valuable. The problem was that they created it without permission. After that meeting, I believe the case was finally becoming clearer. But Daniel called me the next morning with information that erased that confidence. The HOA had filed paperwork claiming ownership interest in the storage facility itself, and they were preparing to argue that removing or transferring control would damage hundreds of residents who depended on it. The settlement was never a victory. It was a warning. Victoria was not trying to save the storage units. She was trying to make sure the court saw them as something bigger than my land. The ownership claim from the HOA changed everything. Until that moment, I believed the biggest challenge was proving the land belonged to me. Now I understood Victoria had a different strategy. She was trying to separate the storage units from the ground they were built on, creating the argument that even if I owned the property, the HOA had rights because they had invested money into the improvements. Daniel told me that was the argument we needed to prepare for. They are moving away from ownership. They are moving toward fairness. That was a much harder battle because fairness can sound convincing even when the facts are complicated. I went back through every document we had collected. But this time I was not looking for proof of my ownership. I was looking for the moment the HOA decided to take a risk. That was when I found the missing piece. Hidden inside the permit records was a communication between the project consultant and the HOA board. The message was not a confession, but it showed something important. Before construction began, the consultant had raised questions about the property description and recommended a final ownership review. The review never happened. Instead, The HOA moved forward using the existing paperwork. That was the second major shift in the case. The issue was no longer whether the HOA could claim they made an honest mistake. The evidence showed they had been warned about uncertainty and chose to continue anyway. But Victoria was not finished. She responded by bringing in a real estate expert who argued that the storage facility had increased the value of the surrounding community. At a public meeting, she did not attack me. She presented herself as someone trying to protect homeowners who had trusted her decisions. Some residents who had previously supported me began questioning whether the lawsuit could hurt the neighborhood. For the first time, I realized the court would not only decide who owned the land. It would decide what happened to a business that many people had become dependent on. That forced me to change my approach again. I stopped focusing only on what the HOA had done wrong. I needed to show what would happen if they were allowed to keep benefiting from someone else's property. Daniel started examining the storage facility records more closely. He requested the rental agreements, financial reports, and operating information connected to the units. A few days later, he called me and told me there was something inside those records that Victoria never expected us to find. The storage units were not just generating income. They contained a complete record of every decision that brought us to court. By the time we prepared for court, I finally understood what the storage units really were. They were not just buildings sitting on my property. They were a timeline. Every rental agreement, every payment record, every approval, and every decision connected to those 12 units showed how the HOA had moved from an uncertain plan into a profitable operation. Daniel organized everything into a clear sequence. The original property records showed ownership. The permit documents showed how the project moved forward. The consultant communication showed the warning signs before construction. The rental records showed the financial benefit after the units were completed. For the first time, the entire picture was visible. But Victoria was preparing too. She did not walk into the final stage of the fight unprepared. Her legal team argued that removing the HOA from the project could create chaos for residents and businesses already using the units. They focused on the value created, the money invested, and the people who trusted the organization. It was a smart argument because it moved attention away from how the project started and toward what existed now. I had to admit something uncomfortable. The storage facility had become useful. People depended on it. That made the situation more complicated than simply saying, "They built it, so tear it down." I needed a solution that protected my rights without ignoring everyone affected by the decisions Victoria made. Daniel helped me refine our final strategy. We were not going to argue that the storage units had no value. We were going to prove that value came from using land the HOA did not control. That distinction became the center of our case. Then we found one final inconsistency in the operating records. The HOA had publicly described the storage facility as a community improvement project, but the financial reports showed revenue projections and management plans that looked like a commercial business. The same project Victoria used to prove she was helping the neighborhood also showed how much control and profit the HOA expected to gain. When Victoria learned we had those records, her response surprised me. She did not attack. She requested one final meeting before court. When we sat across from each other, she looked different from the first day I met her. She was still confident, but there was pressure behind her words. She told me she believed she had built something valuable and that losing it would hurt everyone. For a moment, I understood her perspective. She was not defending empty land. She was defending something she had spent years creating. But then she said something that confirmed the biggest problem. She admitted the HOA never expected me to challenge the project because they believed I would eventually accept their offer. That was the moment I realized the final hearing would not just decide who owned the storage units. It would reveal whether the entire foundation of the project had been built on a mistake Victoria chose to ignore. The courtroom was quieter than I expected. After months of emails, meetings, documents, and arguments, everything came down to the evidence sitting in front of the judge. I sat beside Daniel with the property records, permit documents, consultant communication, and storage facility records organized in front of us. Across the room, Victoria sat with her legal team, calm and prepared. She was not denying that the storage units existed. She was not denying that the HOA managed them. Her argument was more strategic. She wanted the court to see the 12 storage units as a valuable improvement that benefited the community, not as a problem created from the beginning. When her attorney explained the money invested into the project and the number of residents who relied on the facility, I understood why Victoria had been confident for so long. She had built a situation where removing her control would affect many people. Daniel stood up and focused on the one issue that could not be ignored. The question was never whether the storage units had value. The question was whether the HOA had the right to create that value on land they did not own. He walked through the timeline carefully. The property records came first. The permit application came after. The consultant's warning appeared before construction continued. The rental agreements came after the buildings were completed. Every step connected back to the same problem. Then Victoria made her final argument. She admitted there had been confusion about the property records, but she insisted the HOA acted in good faith and created something that should not simply disappear because of a disagreement. Her words were measured. She was no longer trying to win a public argument. She was trying to convince the court that fairness mattered as much as ownership. For a moment, the room felt divided between two ideas: the value that had been created and the rights that had been ignored. Then Daniel presented the financial records from the storage operation. He pointed out the difference between a community project and a business model. The documents showed revenue expectations, rental tracking, and management plans that went far beyond what residents had been told. Victoria's expression changed slightly. It was the first time I saw uncertainty, not because the storage units existed, but because the records showed how much control the HOA expected to keep. The judge reviewed the documents silently for several minutes. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. I looked at the 12 storage units through the courtroom windows in my mind, thinking about how they started as a violation and somehow became the center of the biggest decision of my life. Then the judge asked one question that changed the entire room. Who benefited from the value created on this property before this dispute reached my courtroom? Neither side answered immediately because everyone understood the same thing. The answer would determine what happened next. The judge looked down at the documents one more time before delivering the decision that changed everything. He explained that the issue was not whether the storage units were valuable. They were. The issue was whether the HOA had the legal right to create and profit from that value on land they did not own. The answer was clear. The property records, the permit history, the consultant communication, and the operating records all showed the same pattern. The HOA moved forward with a project while ownership questions remained unresolved, then turned that project into a source of revenue. The court recognized my ownership rights and ruled that the storage facility and the interests connected to it would be handled according to my legal rights as the property owner. After months of fighting, the 12 storage units that had started this entire conflict were no longer controlled by Victoria Whitmore or the HOA. The same doors that once represented everything they believed they could take from me now represented the decision that returned control to the rightful owner. Victoria did not walk away as someone who had simply lost an argument. She faced the consequences of decisions made while leading the HOA, including losing control over the project and facing the financial and administrative impact of a judgment that exposed how the facility had been created. The homeowners also had to confront the truth that the project they supported had been built on a foundation that was never as secure as they were told. When I returned to the property, I stood in front of those same storage units I had discovered months earlier. The gravel was still there. The metal doors still lined the building. The difference was that nobody was pretending anymore. The records had been reviewed. The ownership had been recognized. The story Victoria had built around the project had finally met the facts she could not change. I never wanted a fight with my neighbors. I never wanted to destroy something that people found useful. I wanted the same thing I wanted on the first day I saw those buildings: for the truth about my property to matter. The storage units were no longer a symbol of someone else's control over my land. They became a reminder that patience, preparation, and the right evidence can change the outcome of even the most difficult property dispute. The HOA built those storage units thinking they had created something they could control, but the law proved otherwise. What they built on my land became my victory.